rain upon old stone. Welcome, friends. Draw a little closer and let the noise of the world fade behind you. There are places where every whisper lingers longer than a shout, where forgotten roads vanish beneath moss, and where the scent of bitter herbs clings to the air after every storm. I have walked such paths, and memory has not released them. Come now and listen while the silence begins to speak. The rain had begun before dawn, falling in slow, patient sheets across the towers of the Red Keep until every wall of pale stone gleamed like wet bone beneath the gray sky. Servants crossed the courtyards with their heads lowered, cloaks drawn tightly around their shoulders as they hurried from one hall to another, careful not to linger where the wind came sweeping in from Blackwater Bay. The scent of damp earth drifted through open windows, mingling with wood smoke from the kitchens and the faint sweetness of burning beeswax. King Viserys Targaryen stood alone beneath an arched gallery overlooking the outer ward, one hand resting upon the cold stone balustrade while the rain washed the castle below into shifting shades of silver. He had always found storms quieter than feasts, for thunder asked nothing of a king, while men forever demanded answers. Even so, the morning carried a weight that unsettled him long before any messenger came seeking an audience. The king's fingers lingered over a narrow crack in the weathered stone, worn smooth by generations of hands before his own, and his thoughts wandered toward Dragonstone, where he had spent so much of his younger life. He remembered the taste of salt on the wind, the cries of gulls circling above black cliffs, and the endless echo of waves striking volcanic rock beneath the castle. Dragonstone had never smelled like King's Landing. Its halls carried the sharp scent of sulfur after rain, mingled with seaweed, wet stone, and bitter herbs that clung stubbornly to the cliffs despite the harsh winds. Among those herbs grew wormwood in stubborn clusters, pale leaves trembling whenever storms rolled across the narrow sea. Whenever that scent reached him, even years later, it stirred memories he could never entirely name. Footsteps echoed through the gallery before a guardsman approached, lowering himself onto one knee without hesitation. Water dripped steadily from the edge of his crimson cloak, forming a small pool upon the floor between them. "Your Grace," he said, keeping his voice respectful but urgent, "a rider has arrived from Dragonstone. He bears your brother's seal and asks that only you hear his message." Viserys looked toward the rain for another heartbeat before nodding once. "Bring him to the council chamber," he replied quietly. "See that he is given dry clothing and warm wine before he speaks. A frightened messenger tells half a tale." The guardsman bowed again before disappearing into the dim corridor, leaving only the fading sound of mailed boots upon ancient stone. By the time Viserys entered the small council chamber, the hearth had been stirred into a lively blaze that cast warm light across the carved table at its center. Grand Maester Mello stood beside the fire, reading from a bundle of letters with the patient expression of a man who believed every answer could be found beneath enough layers of parchment. Sir Harold Westerling waited near the doors, his white cloak spotless despite the weather outside, one gloved hand resting easily upon the pommel of his sword. Neither man spoke immediately, for they recognized the look upon the king's face. Viserys disliked surprises carried by exhausted riders. Too often, They arrived wrapped in courtesy while hiding blood beneath their cloaks. He removed his damp gloves, warming his hands briefly over the fire before turning toward the doors as they opened once more. The messenger entered slowly, favoring one leg beneath mud-stained riding leathers that had clearly seen several hard days upon the king's road. Salt had dried white across his cloak, and his face was hollow with exhaustion, though his eyes remained alert. He knelt deeply before the Iron Throne's representative, pressing a leather tube sealed with dark red wax into both hands, as though surrendering something precious. "Your Grace," he said, his voice rough from cold air and little sleep. "I rode without stopping save to change horses. The Castellan of Dragonstone commanded that this reach only your hands." Viserys accepted the tube without ceremony, noticing the seal had not been broken despite the difficult journey. That alone told him whoever carried it understood the value of obedience. The parchment inside proved surprisingly brief. Written in a practiced hand, the king recognized at once. The Castellan reported that a royal convoy, traveling from Dragonstone toward King's Landing, had vanished 2 days earlier along an old mountain road seldom used except by tax collectors and trusted officers. 3 wagons, 12 guards, 2 clerks, and a sworn steward had disappeared without leaving bodies or abandoned horses behind. The cargo listed within the letter was stranger than gold or grain. Ancient ledgers from the reign of King Jaehaerys, maps copied from forgotten Valyrian records, and a sealed coffer bearing the personal sigil of the old king himself had all vanished together. Viserys read the letter twice before folding it carefully, his expression revealing almost nothing. Grand Maester Mellos stepped closer, studying the king's silence rather than the parchment itself. "Bad news seldom grows sweeter with another reading," the old man observed gently. Viserys handed him the letter at last, then walked toward the narrow window where rain blurred the towers beyond into gray shadows. "No request for soldiers," he murmured after a thoughtful pause. "No cry that pirates have landed or castles have risen in rebellion. Only missing wagons and records." Sir Harold folded his arms across his breastplate. If records alone were taken, someone knew what they sought. Common thieves would have emptied the wagons and left the papers to rot. Those words settled heavily over the room, for each man understood the difference between greed and purpose. Mellos finished reading and lowered the parchment with a slow frown. "The ledgers concern taxes collected during the later years of King Jaehaerys," he said. "Old accounts perhaps, but still recognized by the crown. Land grants, inheritance disputes, debts owed by lesser houses, forgotten boundaries. All such matters sleep quietly until someone wakes them." Viserys nodded almost imperceptibly. He had spent enough years hearing petitions to know that ink could spill as much blood as sharpened steel. A forged charter placed before the right lord at the right moment might ignite quarrels lasting generations. If the missing records were altered before returning to the realm, truth itself could become another casualty. The thought disturbed him more than open violence ever had. The king dismissed the servants with a gesture, waiting until the chamber doors closed before speaking again. "How many know of this?" he asked. The messenger lifted weary eyes from the floor. "Only the Castellan, those who searched the road, and now yourselves, your grace. The men feared panic if Word spread that royal documents had vanished. Viserys approved of that caution. Rumor traveled faster than ravens, and once noble houses began whispering about missing records, every old grievance from Dorne to the Neck might suddenly awaken. Silence for the moment remained the crown's strongest shield. Sir Harold unfolded a rough map of the crownlands across the council table, weighing its corners with heavy candlesticks before tracing one gauntleted finger toward a narrow line between wooded hills. "The convoy disappeared here," he said. "Old quarry roads branch away from the main route. Most have been abandoned since the stone was exhausted years ago." Mellos leaned closer, adjusting the sleeves of his chain of office as he studied the faded markings. "Those quarries contain tunnels in places," he remarked. "Some collapse without warning after heavy rain. Others run farther beneath the hills than any map admits." Viserys watched both men in silence while another memory drifted unexpectedly through his thoughts. The smell of wormwood crushed beneath wet boots outside forgotten caves on Dragonstone long ago. He looked again at the sealed coffer mentioned in the letter, though its contents remained undescribed. Jaehaerys had been a careful king who trusted parchment almost as much as dragons, and he seldom sealed anything without reason. Whatever rested inside that coffer had traveled under quiet protection for decades before someone chose this particular journey to strike. Coincidence seemed unlikely. Viserys had learned that whenever several unlikely events arrived together, they usually concealed the shape of a deliberate hand. Somewhere beyond the rain, someone had prepared this theft with patience. The fire crackled softly behind him while wind rattled the shutters, carrying with it the distant cry of gulls circling above the city walls. Viserys drew a slow breath before turning back toward the table. "No banners will be raised," he said with calm certainty. "If we send a host, every lord between here and Dragonstone will know before sunset. Whoever took those wagons would disappear long before our men arrived." Sir Harold inclined his head without objection, though concern lingered plainly in his eyes. Mellos folded the letter carefully and returned it to the king. None of them yet realized that the missing convoy was only the first thread of a knot tied many years before, one that smelled faintly of wormwood and wet stone even before its shape could finally be seen. Morning had scarcely climbed beyond the rain clouds when the king's orders spread quietly through the Red Keep, spoken in low voices instead of shouted across courtyards. Stable hands were told to saddle only a handful of horses, and no royal banners were brought from the armory. Servants assumed Viserys meant to visit a nearby holdfast or shrine, for nothing about the preparations suggested a king riding into danger. That was precisely as he intended. A host announced its purpose with drums and trumpets, but 5 riders wrapped in plain cloaks could pass as lesser nobles traveling the King's Road. Before long, the castle returned to its ordinary rhythm, while those few entrusted with the truth gathered beneath the shadow of the eastern gate. Viserys mounted a tall gray gelding rather than the splendid white stallion reserved for ceremonies, and the choice pleased Sir Harold more than he admitted. A plain horse drew fewer curious eyes, and curiosity often proved more dangerous than swords. Grand Maester Mellos settled awkwardly upon his own mount with the assistance of 2 stable boys, muttering that old bones had never been fashioned for long rides. The messenger from Dragonstone, whose name proved to be Edric Waters, had refused rest despite the journey already behind him. His left knee remained stiff, yet determination held him straighter than comfort ever could. Viserys watched him for a moment before speaking. "You have ridden far enough already." Edric lowered his eyes respectfully. "Then let me ride a little farther, Your Grace. I know where the trail first vanished." They departed through the lesser gate just after sunrise, avoiding the bustling market roads, where merchants crowded beneath dripping awnings. King's Landing gradually disappeared behind them as the King's Road stretched northward, before bending east through fields soaked by the night's rain. The smell of wet grain drifted across the countryside, mingling with fresh earth turned by plows and the smoke rising from distant cottages. Farmers paused briefly to watch the small company pass, offering polite bows without recognizing the cloaked rider at their head. Viserys welcomed that anonymity. For a few hours he was spared the endless burden of ceremony, able instead to observe the realm as ordinary travelers did. The road became rougher by midday, climbing gently into hills where thick woods swallowed much of the daylight beneath towering oaks and beeches. Water trickled from moss-covered stones beside the track, gathering into narrow streams that crossed beneath crude wooden bridges. Ravens perched among bare branches, watching the riders with bright, unsettling eyes before taking wing at the slightest sound. Sir Harold studied every bend ahead while two sworn guards rode several lengths behind, careful to leave no gap large enough for an ambush. Viserys noticed the knight's vigilance and understood it well. Forests had a way of hiding men as easily as deer. During a brief halt beside a shallow brook, Mellos unfolded another collection of copied records from his leather satchel. The old maester's fingers moved carefully across faded ink, as though he feared the letters themselves might disappear if handled too roughly. The convoy carried more than tax ledgers, he said, glancing toward the king. These copies mention surveys of Dragonstone's oldest passages beneath the castle. Most are incomplete, yet they were prepared during the reign of King Jaehaerys by men who descended farther than any living mason. Sir Harold frowned. "Tunnels?" Mellos nodded slowly. "Some natural, shaped by ancient fires beneath the island, others carved by forgotten hands long before Aegon crossed the sea." Viserys listened in thoughtful silence, wondering why anyone would risk murder merely to possess maps that most scholars had ignored for decades. Edric knelt beside the brook to refill a water skin before speaking without looking up. The steward who led the convoy believed one chest held something besides records. He said it was never left unattended, not even during meals. The words drew every eye toward him. "Did he say what?" Viserys asked. Edric shook his head. "Only that the Castellan himself locked it each evening and carried the key upon his person. None of us questioned him. We assumed it contained royal seals or valuables." The king exchanged a measured glance with Mellos. The maester said nothing, yet the deepening lines around his mouth betrayed growing concern. By late afternoon, they reached the crossroads, where the main road divided. From an older path scarcely wide enough for two wagons to pass abreast, grass pushed through broken stones, and thorn bushes crowded the edges where years of neglect had reclaimed the route. Edric pointed toward the narrower road. "The convoy left the King's Road here," he said. The steward wished to avoid flooded ground farther south. It should have saved half a day's travel. Sir Harold dismounted immediately, examining the softened earth with practiced eyes. Hoof prints remained visible despite the rain, though many had blurred into shallow impressions filled with muddy water. He crouched without haste, brushing damp leaves aside with one gloved hand. There were more horses here than the letter reported, Sir Harold said after several moments. The convoy's wagons entered this road, but another mounted party waited nearby before they arrived. He pointed toward a patch of churned earth hidden beneath overhanging branches. See the deeper prints? Freshly shod destriers, not farm horses. They remained still for some time. Viserys joined him, studying the marks with less certainty but equal attention. Even he could distinguish where many hooves had stood together rather than merely passing through. "How many riders?" the king asked. Sir Harold considered carefully before answering. "Perhaps 8, perhaps 10. Enough to overpower 12 guards, if surprise favored them." No broken weapons lay scattered nearby, nor did they discover abandoned shields or blood-stained cloaks. The absence troubled Viserys more than signs of battle might have done. Men defending valuable cargo rarely surrendered without struggle, yet the forest kept its silence as though nothing violent had ever disturbed its peace. Melos dismounted stiffly and wandered a short distance into the undergrowth, stooping beside a clump of pale green plants growing close against a limestone outcrop. He rubbed one leaf gently between his fingers before raising it toward his nose. "Wormwood," he murmured. "There is an abundance of it here." The bitter fragrance drifted faintly through the damp air, sharp enough to cut through the smell of rain and moss. Viserys breathed it in, and once again Dragonstone rose vividly within his memory. They followed the old road deeper into the hills until the trees opened upon an abandoned quarry, half hidden by ivy and creeping vines. Great walls of pale stone surrounded the clearing, scarred by chisels long since rusted away, while rainwater collected in dark pools at the bottom of broken terraces. Silence hung over the place with unnatural weight. Even birds seemed reluctant to settle among the empty ledges. Edric slowed his horse, unease plain upon his face. "I have never ridden this far along the quarry road," he admitted. "Few men come here now." Sir Harold raised one hand, signaling the company to halt, while he searched the clearing on foot. His boots splashed through shallow puddles as he circled a weathered crane abandoned years before. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then he stopped beside a fractured wagon wheel lying half buried beneath loose gravel. The wood had darkened with age, yet one iron band gleamed unexpectedly clean where recent use had scraped away the rust. He beckoned the others without calling aloud. Viserys approached and saw deep grooves carved into the wet ground, leading toward a narrow opening between two towering walls of stone. Something heavy had been dragged through there not many days before. The passage beyond descended into shadow where the rain no longer reached, its floor strewn with loose gravel and broken fragments of rock. Cool air drifted steadily from within, carrying the unmistakable scent of damp stone mixed with bitter wormwood crushed underfoot. Viserys stood at the threshold without speaking, listening to the quiet breath of the earth beyond. Somewhere deep inside, water dripped with slow, measured rhythm, each drop echoing faintly through unseen chambers. Whatever trail they had followed from King's Landing did not end upon the open road. It disappeared into darkness beneath the hills, where patient hands had left almost no trace behind, except the smell of wet stone and herbs growing where sunlight seldom reached. The opening to the quarry tunnel seemed little more than a wound cut into the pale rock, narrow enough that two mounted men could not ride through abreast. Moss clung to the stone, where rainwater seeped from unseen cracks above, and the air spilling from within carried a chill that belonged to deep places untouched by the sun. Sir Harold crouched near the entrance, running his fingers across damp gravel before holding them up for the king to see. Fine dust clung beneath his nails, mixed with fresh scratches where heavy wheels had ground against the stone. "The wagons came this way," he said quietly, "not long ago." Viserys looked into the darkness where the passage bent sharply after only a dozen paces. Whatever waited beyond had been hidden with care. The horses were left beneath the watch of one sworn guard, while the others lit hooded lanterns, shielding the flames from the damp wind. Their light reached only a little way into the tunnel before the darkness swallowed it whole. Mellows sighed as he adjusted his cloak around stiff shoulders. "I have spent my life among books," he muttered. "The books never warned me that kings might lead maesters into abandoned mines." Viserys managed the faintest smile. Perhaps they assumed wiser kings. Even Sir Harold allowed himself the shadow of amusement before drawing his sword with a soft scrape of steel. The brief exchange eased the tension, though only for a moment. Inside, the tunnel sloped steadily downward. Old chisel marks still covered the walls, worn smooth by decades of damp air, until they resembled ripples frozen in stone. Water gathered in shallow hollows beneath their boots, and every footstep echoed ahead, returning moments later from unseen chambers deeper within the hill. The smell of wormwood lingered strangely strong despite the absence of sunlight, as though bundles of the herb had recently been carried through the passage. Edric noticed it as well. "The guards joked about that scent when we rode from Dragonstone," he whispered. "They said it clung to the wagons after rain." Viserys filed the remark away without answering. After several hundred paces, the tunnel widened into a broad chamber where broken tools lay scattered beneath collapsed beams blackened by age. Rusted picks rested where forgotten quarrymen had abandoned them years before, while shattered carts leaned against the walls beneath thick curtains of moss. Sir Harold lifted his lantern higher, studying the floor with narrowed eyes. "Someone has cleaned this place," he observed. At first, the king saw only dust and fallen stone. Then he realized what the night meant. The debris had been pushed neatly aside along one side of the chamber, leaving a broad path clear enough for wagons to pass without obstruction. Near the center of the chamber lay the remains of a campfire no more than 2 nights old. The ashes still held faint traces of warmth beneath their gray crust when Sir Harold tested them with the back of his hand. Around the fire stood several empty clay cups, a cracked wineskin, and scraps of salted beef left carelessly behind. Whoever had camped there had departed in haste, confident no one would follow them underground. Mellos knelt beside one of the cups, lifting it carefully. "Not quarrymen," he murmured, "nor wandering shepherds. Men expecting company do not linger in abandoned tunnels. Viserys slowly surveyed the chamber. The place felt less like a hiding place than a crossroads. One of the guards called softly from the far wall. Half concealed behind a leaning timber rested the first unmistakable sign of violence. A royal shield bearing the crowned three-headed dragon had been split almost clean through by a heavy axe blow. Its painted surface was scratched and smeared with dried mud, but no blood stained the wood. Nearby lay a snapped spear shaft and a broken sword belt whose bronze buckle still carried the sigil of the royal household. Viserys bent to retrieve the buckle, turning it thoughtfully in his hand. "If 12 guards were overcome," he said, "they did not all die here." Sir Harold nodded grimly. "No bodies, no blood enough for slaughter. They were taken." The realization settled over the company with uncomfortable force. Dead men ended questions. Captives created many more. Edric swallowed hard before speaking. "Why spare them?" Viserys answered before anyone else could. "Because living witnesses may still serve a purpose. Either they were forced to work." He paused, considering the cleared roadway through the chamber. "Or they were taken somewhere they could not easily return from." Mellos glanced toward the deeper tunnels where darkness pooled beyond the lantern light. "If so, we are following men who planned every step before the convoy ever left Dragonstone." They pressed onward through another passage branching east, narrower than the first, but marked by fresh wheel ruts pressed into damp clay. The tunnel twisted repeatedly, making it impossible to judge direction, while unseen water flowed somewhere behind the walls with a constant whisper. At one bend, the roof dipped so low that even Viserys had to bow his head to pass beneath jagged stone. The farther they descended, the cooler the air became. Condensation gathered upon the lantern glass, softening the light until shadows seemed to move just beyond its reach. Every few moments Sir Harold paused to listen, yet no voices answered the silence. The next chamber differed from the first. Here the stone walls had been shaped more carefully, their surfaces smoother and darker, almost glassy in places where ancient volcanic heat had transformed the rock. Mellos stopped so abruptly that Edric nearly walked into him. "These are not quarry workings," the maester said, tracing one hand across the polished wall. "This section is far older." His lantern illuminated faint carvings nearly erased by time, curving lines intertwined with dragons whose wings spread across the stone in elegant, unfamiliar patterns unlike the heraldry of later kings. Viserys stepped closer, recognizing the style from old halls on Dragonstone itself. "Valyrian," he said quietly. "Or close enough?" A narrow alcove opened beside the carvings, little more than a recess in the wall. Within it rested several bundles wrapped in coarse cloth. Sir Harold cut one open with the point of his sword. Dry wormwood spilled across the floor in brittle heaps, filling the chamber with its bitter fragrance. Another bundle held the same. A third contained fresh branches, still green despite the darkness underground. Edric frowned in confusion. "Why carry herbs into a mine?" Mellos answered thoughtfully. "Wormwood masks odors. Hunters sometimes use it. So do certain healers." Viserys added another possibility. "Or men who do not wish tracking dogs to follow their scent." The discovery changed the nature of the hunt. Whoever had hidden the convoy possessed discipline, planning, and knowledge of places forgotten by nearly everyone else. They had disguised their trail chosen abandoned tunnels instead of open roads, and carried supplies enough for an organized company rather than desperate outlaws. Sir Harold extinguished one lantern to preserve its oil, leaving only 2 lights burning. "This was never the work of common brigands," he said. "Someone with coin stands behind them." Viserys found himself agreeing. Gold alone could buy swords, but only careful purpose inspired such preparation. A sudden sound echoed faintly through the tunnel ahead. It lasted scarcely longer than a heartbeat, a dull scrape followed by what might have been a stone striking another somewhere in the darkness. Every man froze. Sir Harold raised one hand while the guards silently lowered their lanterns. No one breathed above a whisper. The silence returned so completely that Viserys wondered whether the noise had been imagined, until another faint echo drifted toward them, softer than before, yet unmistakably human. Somewhere ahead, beyond the twisting passages and ancient stone, someone else was moving through the darkness. No one spoke after the second sound reached them. Sir Harold lifted 2 fingers, signaling the guards to shield the lanterns with their cloaks, and at once the chamber fell into a dim amber gloom where every shadow seemed to deepen. Viserys stood perfectly still, listening until his ears adjusted to the silence between the distant drips of water. The scrape had come from somewhere ahead, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Whoever had made it was either unaware of the king's company or had already realized they were no longer alone. Neither possibility offered much comfort. They advanced with slow, measured steps, leaving the chamber of Valyrian carvings behind. The passage narrowed before opening into a long gallery supported by thick stone pillars, left standing when the quarrymen had carved away the surrounding rock. The lantern light stretched between those pillars in uneven bands, revealing scattered rubble and pools of dark water that reflected the flames like broken mirrors. The air carried a stronger scent of damp limestone here, while the bitterness of wormwood lingered only in faint traces. Sir Harold paused beside one pillar and pointed downward without speaking. Fresh footprints crossed the wet stone, some broad and heavy, others narrow enough to belong to boys or smaller men. They led deeper into the gallery. The tracks soon divided. One set continued forward, while another turned sharply toward a side passage almost hidden behind a curtain of hanging roots that had forced their way through cracks in the ceiling. Sir Harold studied both trails in silence before crouching to touch the damp earth. The larger group went ahead, he murmured. 3, perhaps 4 men came this way instead. Edric looked uneasily toward the hidden passage. "Scouts?" he asked. The knight considered the question. "Or guards left behind to watch the road?" Viserys weighed the choice carefully before answering. If they expected pursuit, they would not leave their rear unguarded. We follow the smaller trail. The concealed passage twisted sharply through natural rock, unlike the straighter quarry tunnels they had left behind. Here the walls glistened with moisture, and pale fungi clung to the cracks where water seeped endlessly through the stone. Their boots disturbed centuries of silence, sending tiny pebbles skittering into unseen crevices below. Melos breathed more heavily now, though he refused every offer to rest. "Age is an unkind traveling companion," he muttered between breaths. Viserys glanced back toward him. "Yet you keep pace." the old maester answered with a weary smile. A king walking ahead has a way of persuading old men to forget aching knees. Around the next bend, the passage ended at a narrow wooden door set strangely into the living rock. Time had darkened the timber almost black, while rust spread across iron hinges thick enough to support a castle gate. No lock remained upon it. Instead, the latch hung open as though someone had passed through. Only moments before, Sir Harold pressed one ear against the wood before cautiously pushing it inward. The hinges groaned softly despite his care. Beyond lay a storage chamber where stacks of weathered barrels leaned against the walls beneath heavy layers of dust, save for a broad path recently cleared between them. One of the guards moved toward the nearest barrel and pried loose its cracked lid. Inside lay nothing but spoiled grain turned hard with age. Another barrel held shattered tools wrapped in rotten cloth. The third revealed several coils of fresh rope, neatly wound and entirely free of dust. Beside it rested iron shackles polished by recent use. The discovery silenced the room. Viserys picked up one length of chain, its metal still cold from the damp air, and his expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "They prepared this place long before the convoy disappeared," he said. Sir Harold nodded. "No man carries spare chains unless he expects prisoners." Edric's face had grown noticeably pale. He wandered toward the far wall where another object lay half concealed beneath a discarded blanket. Kneeling, he drew it into the lantern light with trembling hands. It was a leather satchel bearing the seal of the royal treasury, its strap cut cleanly through by a knife. The contents had been emptied except for several loose sheets of parchment soaked beyond reading. "This belonged to Master Olivar," Edric whispered. "He kept the convoy accounts." His voice faltered as he turned the ruined satchel over. He never let it leave his shoulder. Viserys accepted the satchel carefully, seeing faint scratches upon the clasp where someone had forced it open in haste. Mello spread the surviving parchments across an empty barrel, hoping at least a few words might still be legible. Most of the ink had bled into dark stains, but one page preserved several names, along with columns of numbers and abbreviated notes. The maester leaned close to the lantern, squinting through weary eyes. "These are inventories," he said after a long silence. The missing records were listed individually before departure. He traced one finger downward until it stopped beside a short notation written in firmer ink than the rest. "Chest 7, to remain sealed, by command of His Grace." Mellos looked toward Viserys. "You gave no such command." "No," Viserys replied quietly. "Nor did I know there was a 7th chest." The words hung heavily in the stale air. Every report sent from Dragonstone had mentioned only the ledgers, maps, and the sealed coffer bearing Jaehaerys' sigil. Yet someone within the castle had quietly added another chest to the convoy, labeling it with the king's own authority. Sir Harold frowned. Then whoever organized the theft may have cared less about the known cargo than about something hidden among it. Viserys folded the damp parchment with deliberate care. A deception concealed inside another deception rarely ended simply. As they searched the chamber further, one of the guards called softly from a dark corner beyond the barrels. There, partly obscured beneath a heap of broken planks, lay the body of a man. His hands remained bound behind his back, though the ropes had loosened after death. He wore no armor, only a coarse wool tunic stained with quarry dust and dried blood. A narrow knife wound pierced the side of his neck with brutal precision. Sir Harold knelt beside him, examining the corpse without touching the blade still lodged in the wound. Dead perhaps a day, he concluded. Not one of the royal guards. Edric hesitated before stepping closer. He studied the dead man's face beneath the lantern light, then slowly shook his head. I have never seen him. Mellos crouched opposite Sir Harold, his expression thoughtful rather than horrified. His hands, the maester observed. Thick calluses covered the man's palms and fingers. A laborer, quarryman perhaps, though these tunnels have stood empty for years. Viserys looked more closely and noticed a faded tattoo upon the inside of the dead man's wrist, nearly obscured by dirt. It resembled a crude anchor crossed with a spear. A sailor? He suggested. Sir Harold considered it. Or a sellsword who once served aboard a ship. The knife itself drew the knight's attention next. Its hilt was plain ashwood wrapped in dark leather, but the blade bore a tiny maker's mark near the guard. Sir Harold scraped away the blood with his thumb until the symbol emerged. It showed a small tower beside 3 stars. Mellos stared at it for several moments before recognition stirred. I have seen that mark before, he said slowly. Not here, years ago. He closed his eyes, searching memory with visible effort. A smith? No, a small forge supplying men-at-arms sworn to houses along Crackclaw Point. Viserys looked toward the old Maester. You are certain? Mellos nodded once, as certain as an old memory allows. Before anyone could speak again, a faint glow appeared beneath the storage room's second door, a narrow line of wavering orange where none had existed moments earlier. Someone on the opposite side carried a lantern through the darkness. The light paused outside as though its bearer had stopped to listen. Every man in the chamber instinctively reached for steel or held his breath. Then the latch began to move with agonizing slowness, and the ancient door creaked inward by the width of a single hand. The door opened another finger's breadth before stopping altogether. The narrow line of lantern light widened across the floor, illuminating drifting dust and the edge of a weathered barrel. Yet whoever stood beyond did not step inside. Sir Harold raised his sword, without a sound, shifting his weight until he stood just beyond the doorway's arc. One guard extinguished his lantern with thumb and forefinger, plunging half the chamber into darkness while the remaining flame burned low behind a stack of crates. Viserys felt the steady beat of his own heart, but kept his breathing even. The silence stretched long enough to become almost unbearable. At last a voice came through the opening, low and uncertain. Is someone there? It belonged to a young man no older than 20 by the sound of it, and there was more fear than confidence behind the words. No answer came from within the chamber. Another cautious step followed, then the lantern entered first, held before its bearer like a shield. The youth wore rough wool beneath a patched leather jerkin, and his beard had scarcely begun to grow. A short sword hung awkwardly at his belt, the weapon of a man unfamiliar with carrying steel. He saw the barrels before he saw the king's company. By then, it was too late. Sir Harold moved with startling speed, One hand seized the young man's wrist while the other pressed cold steel against his throat before he could cry out. The lantern slipped from nerveless fingers, but Viserys caught it just before it struck the floor. The captive gasped once, his face drained of color, and instinctively reached for his sword, only to freeze when the blade at his neck bit lightly into the skin. "Do not," Sir Harold said quietly. "You will regret it before I do." The young man swallowed hard and slowly lifted both empty hands. Viserys stepped forward into the lantern light, drawing back the hood of his travel cloak. Recognition did not come at once. The captive studied the king's face with growing confusion before his eyes widened in disbelief. His knees weakened beneath him. Your Grace," he whispered. The words seemed to steal what little courage remained. Sir Harold eased the sword back only slightly, without lowering it altogether. "You know who stands before you," the knight said. "That makes lying an even poorer choice." The youth gave his name as Tobbit, the son of a charcoal burner from a village 2 days to the north. His hands trembled so violently that he struggled to keep them still, though whether from fear or exhaustion none could tell. Viserys regarded him carefully. There was dirt beneath the young man's nails and fresh blisters upon his palms, signs of hard labor rather than a seasoned outlaw. His sword showed scarcely a mark from use. Whatever role Tobbit played, he was no hardened killer. That alone made him worth questioning before judgment. "I was hired," Tobbit said after several moments, his voice barely louder than the dripping water beyond the chamber. "Only to carry supplies. They said there would be good silver for simple work." Viserys remained silent, allowing the young man to continue rather than pressing him too quickly. "We brought food, rope, oil, and herbs from villages along the coast. I never asked why." He glanced toward the corpse lying near the wall and shut his eyes for an instant. "When I wanted to leave, they killed Jory instead." His voice faltered. He said he would tell the nearest lord what was happening. Sir Harold's expression did not soften. "Who are they?" Tobbit hesitated, licking dry lips before answering. "Not one company. Different men came and went. Some wore mail, some dressed like fishermen, others looked like merchants, though they handled swords better than ledgers." Mellos listened intently, committing every word to memory. "Did they have a captain?" The youth nodded uncertainly. "A knight. They called him Sir, but never by his name while others could hear." Viserys noticed how carefully the answer had been given. Either Tobbit truly did not know, or fear still governed what he dared reveal. The king crouched beside the young man until they stood nearly eye to eye. "Look at me," Viserys said calmly. After a moment, Tobbit obeyed. "Men have already died in these tunnels. More will die if you hide the truth." The youth searched the king's face, perhaps expecting anger or threats, but found only quiet resolve. "I swear by the seven," Tobbit whispered. "I never saw his face clearly. He wore a dark cloak and kept his visor lowered, even underground." Viserys believed that part at least. Leaders who concealed themselves from their own followers seldom trusted those followers to survive. Mellos unfolded the damp inventory, recovered from the satchel, and held it before Tobbit. "Did you see the wagons brought here?" he asked. Tobbit nodded. "Only once. They arrived after nightfall." His eyes drifted toward the passage beyond the door. "The prisoners were still alive then. Their hands were tied, but they walked. Edric stepped forward at once. All of them? The youth shook his head. No. 2 guards were missing. I never learned what became of them. Relief mixed uneasily with fresh concern upon Edric's face. At least some of the convoy had survived the ambush. What happened to the cargo? Viserys asked. Tobit drew a slow breath before answering. Most of the chests stayed here until dawn. Then the knight ordered them separated. He pointed toward the deeper tunnels. The ledgers and maps went one way, the sealed coffer another. His hand lowered gradually. There was one chest no one else was allowed to touch. 4 men carried it together, though it was not the largest. Mellos and Sir Harold exchanged a silent glance. The hidden 7th chest again. Whatever it contained, it had been guarded more carefully than anything officially listed. The king rose and walked slowly across the chamber, considering everything they had learned. The theft had not been driven by desperation or sudden opportunity. It had unfolded in stages, each movement planned long before the convoy left Dragonstone. Different groups handled different parts of the cargo. Supplies had been gathered quietly, laborers hired without understanding the whole design. Even the prisoners had been divided from the stolen records. Such precision required not only money but patience. Somewhere above ground, someone of consequence had woven these strands together over many months. Sir Harold questioned Tobit further about the tunnels ahead. The youth described a maze of old quarry passages, some natural and others widened by forgotten miners, where strangers could wander for days without finding daylight again. Several exits opened onto wooded hillsides miles apart, while another descended toward sea caves, reachable only during low tide. They argued about that path, Tobit recalled. One man said the tide had turned early after the storm. Mellos frowned thoughtfully. Sea caves? He murmured. That explains the smell of salt we noticed despite being so far inland. Viserys felt another piece of the puzzle settle into place. Whoever organized the theft intended to move the cargo beyond the roads entirely. As the questioning drew to a close, a distant sound rolled faintly through the stone. It resembled thunder at first, low and uneven, until Edric's face tightened with recognition. Not thunder, he whispered. Everyone fell silent. The noise came again, louder this time. Wheels, heavy wooden wheels, grinding slowly over stone somewhere beyond the tunnels ahead. Sir Harold extinguished the remaining lantern until only a narrow slit of light escaped its hood. Someone was moving a wagon deep beneath the hills, and after all the careful concealment, they had arrived just in time to hear it. The grinding of the wheels came and went with strange irregularity, sometimes loud enough to seem only a few passages away, then fading until it became little more than a memory carried through the stone. No horse accompanied the sound, nor did they hear the sharp commands of teamsters urging beasts forward. Sir Harold tilted his head, listening with the practiced attention of a man who had spent years distinguishing danger from harmless noise. Men are pulling it, he whispered at last. Heavy loads move differently when ropes replace horses. Viserys understood immediately why that mattered. A wagon dragged by men could travel where no animal would willingly descend. Tobit led them from the storage chamber through another winding passage, his pace hesitant at first until Sir Harold quietly reminded him that there was nowhere safer than beside the king. The tunnel sloped steadily downward, and before long the air changed again. The dry scent of old stone gave way to something colder, carrying traces of salt and the unmistakable freshness of moving water. Tiny streams crossed the floor, disappearing into cracks beneath their boots, while moisture gathered on the walls in shimmering beads. Every few dozen steps, they passed iron rings driven into the rock, their surfaces worn smooth by countless ropes that had once hauled quarried stone toward daylight. The old workings had not merely been abandoned. They had been built to move burdens far heavier than ledgers and wooden chests. Around the next bend, they extinguished both lanterns together. A pale glow flickered ahead, weak but unmistakable, spilling through a narrow archway where the passage widened once more. They advanced in darkness, one careful step after another, guided by the wavering light beyond. Viserys could hear men breathing before he saw them. A rope creaked under strain, boots scraped across gravel. Someone muttered an impatient curse, followed by another voice ordering silence. The king flattened himself against the damp wall beside the arch, while Sir Harold slowly leaned forward, just enough to look inside. Beyond lay a cavern far larger than any chamber they had yet discovered. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, supported by towering pillars of untouched stone left standing when ancient miners had carved away the surrounding rock. Near the center, 6 men hauled a broad wagon across uneven ground with thick hempen ropes looped around their shoulders. 2 lanterns hung from iron hooks driven into the walls, casting restless light across stacked crates and bundles wrapped in oilcloth. At the far end of the cavern, another passage descended toward complete darkness, from which drifted the distant roar of unseen waves. Even underground, the sea had found its voice. Sir Harold withdrew before anyone noticed them. 8 men visible, he breathed, perhaps more beyond the wagon. Tobbit swallowed nervously. They change watches every few hours. If those are the men I think they are, another group will soon arrive from the shore. Viserys studied the rough sketch of the cavern that formed in his mind from the knight's description. Charging blindly would be folly, yet allowing the wagon to vanish deeper toward the sea might lose them the trail altogether. The decision had to be made before another wheel turned. He motioned Mellos closer. "If they escape by water," the king murmured, "can they reach Blackwater Bay unseen?" The old maester nodded reluctantly. "The coast beneath these hills is riddled with caves. Smugglers have hidden there for generations, though few maps mark the entrances." Viserys glanced toward the faint glow spilling through the arch. "Then we stop the wagon here." Sir Harold's expression remained composed, but his eyes approved the choice. A confined cavern favored disciplined fighters over scattered smugglers. The king leaned toward the 2 sworn guards. "No shouting unless steel leaves its scabbard. If we can seize 1 man before the rest understand what has happened, do so." Both guards nodded. Their faces betrayed neither excitement nor fear, only the calm focus of men long accustomed to obeying difficult orders. Tobbit looked as though he wished himself 100 leagues away, yet he did not flee. Viserys noticed the effort it took for the young laborer simply to remain standing. Courage often arrived wearing the face of terror. They moved together with deliberate care. Sir Harold crossed the threshold first, keeping to the shadows behind a line of abandoned stone blocks, One guard circled left, while the other slipped toward a pile of broken timbers. Viserys remained a pace behind the knight, sword still sheathed. He had no illusions about matching seasoned men in battle, but he refused to hide while others accepted the risk in his place. The smell of wet rope, sweat, and wormwood hung thickly over the cavern, mixing with the cold breath of the sea until the air tasted faintly bitter. The nearest laborer never saw Sir Harold approach. One gloved hand clamped over the man's mouth while the knight's other arm locked around his chest, dragging him silently behind a stone pillar before he could struggle. Another man turned at the faint scrape of boots and frowned toward the darkness. "Hob?" he called quietly. "Where have you gone?" His question received no answer. He took 2 cautious steps forward, lantern held high, peering between the pillars. That hesitation proved enough. The second guard sprang from concealment, striking the man's wrist with the flat of his sword. The lantern crashed to the ground, its flames sputtering wildly without going out. The cavern erupted into motion. One smuggler shouted a warning, while another abandoned the wagon rope and snatched up a hand axe lying nearby. Sir Harold met him before the weapon could rise, driving the man's shoulder hard against a stone pillar with such force that the axe clattered harmlessly across the floor. The remaining men scattered instead of standing together, each seeking a different escape through the maze of pillars. Viserys drew his sword at last, not rushing forward, but holding the narrow passage leading back toward the storage chamber. One fleeing laborer saw the king blocking his path, hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, then surrendered without resistance, dropping to his knees with shaking hands. The fight lasted less than a minute. 2 smugglers lay groaning where they had fallen. Another had escaped into the darkness beyond the seaward passage, and 3 more found themselves bound with their own hauling ropes. The wagon remained where they had abandoned it, its wheels wedged against loose stones. Mellos hurried to examine the prisoners, while Sir Harold listened toward the tunnel where the escaped man had vanished. "He is running for someone," the knight said grimly, "not merely running away." The echo of retreating footsteps had already disappeared into the distant roar of waves. Viserys approached the wagon slowly. A heavy canvas had been stretched across its cargo and secured with thick cords, still damp from the sea air. He untied the nearest knot himself and folded back the covering. Beneath it rested 6 wooden chests marked with faded royal seals, exactly as described in the Castellan's letter. The ledgers had been found at last, yet the king's eyes immediately noticed what was missing. There was no sealed coffer bearing Jaehaerys' sigil, and no trace whatsoever of the mysterious 7th chest added under false royal authority. Someone had divided the treasure exactly as Tobit had claimed. The records had never been the true prize. They had merely concealed it long enough for the real prize to disappear into the darkness ahead. For a long moment, no one spoke. The recovered chest rested upon the wagon exactly where they had been abandoned, their iron bands damp with condensation and their royal seals smeared by rough handling but otherwise unbroken. Viserys laid one hand upon the nearest lid, feeling the cold wood beneath his fingers. Months of labor had gone into preparing these records, and years of history lay preserved within them, yet they now seemed almost secondary. Whoever had orchestrated the theft had gone to extraordinary lengths only to leave them behind. The true purpose of the ambush had traveled elsewhere. Grand Meister Melos knelt beside one of the chests and carefully examined the wax seal before looking toward the king. "Untouched," he said with visible relief. "At least outwardly." Viserys nodded. "Open one." Sir Harold glanced toward the tunnel where the escaped man had vanished, but offered no objection. One of the guards produced a small pry bar from the wagon itself and worked it beneath the lid until the old nails gave way with a reluctant groan. Inside lay tightly packed bundles of parchment wrapped in waxed cloth. Melos lifted one bundle into the lantern light, turning several pages with practiced hands before exhaling slowly. "These are genuine," he said, "the tax ledgers from the 36th year of King Jaehaerys." Viserys allowed himself only a brief measure of satisfaction. Then the theft was never meant to erase the crown's records. His gaze swept across the remaining chests. Those were bait. The realization settled uneasily over the cavern. Sir Harold rested one hand upon the wagon's sideboard, his brow furrowed. Most thieves steal the richest chest and abandon the rest. These men carried away the only cargo that no one officially knew existed. Melos closed the ledger with deliberate care. Someone at Dragonstone prepared the convoy list to conceal it. The old maester's voice had grown quieter. That means the conspiracy began before a single wheel left the castle. One of the bound prisoners, a broad-shouldered man with a scar running from his ear to his jaw, laughed bitterly through split lips. The sound echoed unpleasantly around the cavern until Sir Harold silenced him with a hard look. "You have found your books," the prisoner said hoarsely. "You should ride home while you still can." Viserys stepped toward him without haste. "Why?" The man shrugged as much as the ropes allowed. "Because the men who hired us expected pursuit. They said anyone clever enough to reach the quarry would never leave the coast." His smile held neither triumph nor mockery, only weary certainty. "You are already too late." Sir Harold crouched before the prisoner. "Who hired you?" The man spat blood onto the stone between them. "Coin hires faster than names." The knight remained patient. "Someone paid enough to keep your tongue loyal." The prisoner's smile faded. "Loyal?" he muttered. "Half the men here had never met before last month. We were promised silver, nothing more." Viserys studied him carefully. His clothing was patched, his boots worn nearly through at the soles. This was no household knight or trusted retainer. He was a hired blade who knew only fragments of a much larger design. Another captive proved less stubborn. Thin-faced and scarcely older than Tobbit, he kept glancing fearfully toward the seaward tunnel, as though expecting someone to emerge from it at any moment. Melos offered him water, before asking the simplest question of all. "What frightened you enough to stay?" The young man hesitated before answering. "The night." His voice trembled despite himself. He said, "Anyone who deserted would be hunted down before winter." Sir Harold leaned forward slightly. "Did you ever hear another man call him by name?" The captive nodded once. Only once. Someone called him Sir Lymond before they remembered themselves. The name settled over the company like an unwelcome draft. Viserys frowned faintly, searching memory. It stirred no immediate recognition. Melos looked equally uncertain, but Sir Harold's expression sharpened. "Lymond," he repeated quietly. There was a hedge knight by that name years ago. He fought in tourneys along Cracklaw Point. The old maester turned toward him. Did he hold lands? Sir Harold shook his head. None that I recall. Skilled enough with a lance, but fortune seldom favored him. Viserys listened without interrupting. A hedge knight could lead sellswords, certainly, but such a man alone could not have infiltrated Dragonstone's records or arranged false inventories bearing the king's authority. Before further questions could be asked, a gust of cold air swept through the cavern. The lantern flames bent sharply toward the tunnel descending to the sea, flickering so violently that shadows leaped across the walls. With the wind came another sound. Not voices this time. Bells, faint, uneven, and distant, as though a buoy somewhere beyond the cliffs rocked against the tide. Tobit's face paled at once. Low tide, he whispered. They've reached the caves. Mellos looked toward the tunnel. Then boats can enter where they could not before. Viserys understood immediately. The missing coffer and the hidden seventh chest were already moving beyond the hills. The king made his decision without hesitation. Harold, the Lord Commander turned at once. Take one guard and return these prisoners to daylight. Send ravens from the nearest holdfast to Dragonstone and King's Landing. The records have been recovered, but the hunt continues. Sir Harold's jaw tightened. Your Grace, I should remain with you. Viserys met his eyes steadily. If I disappear beneath these hills, the realm will need a man who knows what happened here. For several heartbeats neither spoke. At last the knight inclined his head, though the decision plainly displeased him. You will not go alone, Sir Harold said. I forbid it whether I possess the authority or not. The words carried enough force to draw the faintest smile from Viserys, despite the danger surrounding them. Then who rides with me? The knight answered immediately. Edric knows the convoy. Tobit knows these tunnels. Mellos knows why these records matter. One guard remains besides myself. The king considered the proposal only briefly before nodding. 4 companions would be easier to conceal than a larger force, and speed now outweighed numbers. The prisoners were secured within the storage chamber under the watch of the departing guard, who received careful instructions before disappearing with Sir Harold toward the quarry entrance. Viserys watched until the lantern light of the 2 men vanished into the winding passage. For the first time since leaving King's Landing, the Lord Commander no longer stood beside him. The absence felt strangely heavy. Harold Westerling had guarded kings for decades. To continue without him meant trusting narrower chances and quicker judgments. Mellos adjusted the strap of his satchel with a weary sigh. Your Grace, he said quietly, I suspect whatever rested inside that hidden chest was never intended for the archives. Viserys looked toward the tunnel where the smell of salt had grown steadily stronger. Nor do I. The old master hesitated before continuing. If someone risked this much to steal it, we must prepare ourselves for disappointment. We may discover not treasure, but secrets. Viserys drew his cloak tighter against the damp wind. Secrets have toppled kingdoms before. Let us ensure this one does not. They entered the descending passage with only a single lantern between them. The tunnel narrowed until the walls brushed their shoulders, then widened again into natural caverns, untouched by hammer or chisel. Salt crystals glittered faintly across the stone where ancient tides had once reached farther inland. Ahead, the roar of the sea grew louder with every step, joined now by the distant cry of gulls filtering down through hidden cracks above. Somewhere beyond the darkness lay the coast, the waiting boats, and the men carrying the king's greatest unanswered question. The scent of wormwood had almost vanished, replaced by cold, salt, wet stone, and the promise that the most dangerous part of their journey had only just begun. The passage descended in long, uneven slopes carved more by ancient water than by the hands of men. Every few dozen paces the floor changed beneath their boots, from rough volcanic stone to smooth rock polished by centuries of hidden tides. The air had grown noticeably colder, carrying the sharp taste of salt that settled upon the tongue with every breath. Somewhere ahead, waves struck stone in slow, rhythmic bursts, their echoes rolling through the caverns until it became impossible to judge distance. Viserys lifted the hood of his cloak against the damp wind. Though it offered little warmth, the sea lay close now. He could feel its presence before he could see it. Edric guided them with increasing confidence despite his earlier uncertainty. The castle fisherman spoke of caves beneath these cliffs, he said over his shoulder, keeping his voice low enough that it vanished into the roar of the surf. Most believed they were only tales meant to frighten boys away from dangerous waters. Talbot nodded uneasily. The men who hired me never entered through the quarry after the first week. They came from below. Melos glanced toward the ceiling where thin cracks admitted faint drafts from the world above. Hidden harbors have served smugglers since before Aegon's conquest, the old maester observed. Few kings concern themselves with places no tax collector can easily reach. Viserys considered that truth in silence. Neglect often created opportunities more dangerous than rebellion. The tunnel curved sharply before ending at the edge of an immense cavern open to the sea. Pale daylight filtered through a wide crack where the cliff had split ages ago, revealing dark green water surging far below against jagged rocks. A narrow stone ledge wound along one side of the cavern, scarcely wide enough for two men to walk abreast. Across the water rested a crude wooden landing built against the rock, where several small boats bobbed gently with the tide, their mooring ropes creaking against weathered posts. One boat had already pushed away from the landing. 4 oars dipped steadily into the gray water, while a 5th man stood at the stern holding a lantern high despite the daylight filtering into the cave. "There," Edric whispered. Viserys followed the movement of the departing boat until he noticed something else. Upon the landing remained 3 wagons, stripped of their wheels and axles, reduced to little more than wooden frames that could never again travel a road. Their planks had been dismantled carefully, not broken in haste, leaving behind piles of iron fittings, stacked with surprising order. Whoever had planned this route had never intended to lead wagons back through the hills. They had served their purpose only until the cargo reached the sea. The king's gaze shifted toward the boat already moving into deeper water. Several large chests rested beneath oilcloth near its bow. Talbot caught Viserys gently by the sleeve before he stepped onto the ledge. "Listen." The king remained still. Beneath the waves and the groaning ropes came another sound, softer and more dangerous. Voices echoed faintly from somewhere above the landing. Not from the departing boat, from the cliff itself. Sir Harold's warning returned immediately to Viserys' thoughts. The escaped smuggler had not fled blindly. He had gone to summon help. The men below were only part of the force waiting within these caves. They retreated behind a curtain of hanging stone just as 6 armed figures emerged from an upper passage overlooking the landing. Unlike the laborers captured in the quarry, these men carried themselves with practiced confidence. Their mail shirts were well maintained despite the damp air, and each wore the same plain dark cloak without sigils or badges. One among them stood taller than the others. His black half-helm concealed much of his face, while a dark green cloak fell almost to his boots. Even at a distance, he possessed the quiet authority of a man accustomed to command. He surveyed the cavern without apparent haste before speaking. "The boat has departed?" His voice carried clearly across the water. One of the mailed men bowed his head. "Moments ago, sister. The tide serves us well." The cloaked knight remained silent for several heartbeats, watching the shrinking vessel disappear toward a narrow opening where daylight shone more brightly. "And the quarry?" he asked at last. The answer came too quickly. No word. The knight's stillness changed almost imperceptibly. He neither raised his voice nor reached for his sword, yet every man around him straightened at once. "No word," he repeated. "That is not an answer. Send 2 men back." The escaped smuggler suddenly emerged from the tunnel behind them. Breathing hard from his climb, he fell to one knee before the knight. "Sir," he gasped, "they're here, the king himself." Every sound within the cavern seemed to vanish for an instant. Even the waves appeared to hesitate. The knight did not speak immediately. He looked toward the tunnel through which the messenger had arrived, then slowly removed one leather glove. Upon the back of his right hand stretched a pale scar crossing from thumb to wrist, old enough to have faded almost white. "How many?" he asked calmly. I saw 4, perhaps 5. And you ran." The smuggler lowered his eyes. "You did well enough." There was neither praise nor anger in the knight's voice, only quiet calculation. He turned toward 2 of his men. "Collapse the western passage. We no longer require it." Another pair received fresh orders. "Ready the second boat. If they reach the landing before the tide turns, kill them." The commands were delivered with the ease of a man moving pieces across a sea-vast board. No one questioned him. Viserys watched from concealment, studying the stranger as carefully as the stranger unknowingly directed his men. This could only be the hedge knight called Sir Lymond, yet nothing about him resembled a desperate adventurer chasing fortune. Every movement suggested discipline learned through years of command. More troubling still, he seemed entirely unsurprised that the king had entered the tunnels. He had planned for pursuit from the beginning. The realization settled heavily upon Viserys. Somewhere above these cliffs, another mind had anticipated nearly every choice the crown might make. Melos leaned close enough that only the king could hear him. "If that boat escapes the caves, it may reach open water before sunset." Viserys nodded without taking his eyes from the landing. The vessel carrying the hidden chest had almost disappeared beyond the mouth of the cavern, where the sea beyond flashed silver beneath the storm clouds. One chance remained, and it was narrowing with every stroke of the oars. Then from somewhere outside the cave, faint but unmistakable, came the distant cry of a war horn drifting across Blackwater Bay. The sound echoed once against the cliffs before fading into the wind, and for the first time uncertainty crossed the face of the night below. The note of the horn faded into the wind, yet its echo lingered beneath the stone vault, like the memory of distant thunder. Every man upon the landing turned instinctively toward the narrow mouth of the sea cave where a strip of gray daylight shimmered beyond the restless water. Even the cloaked knight remained motionless for the span of several breaths, his attention fixed upon the entrance. Viserys watched him closely. The sound had not frightened the man, but it had interrupted calculations already made. Whatever timetable governed the conspiracy, an unexpected ship upon Blackwater Bay threatened it. One of the mailed men hurried back from the cave mouth, boots slipping upon the wet planks, before he caught himself. "A sail, sir," he reported, breathing hard. "Only one that I could see, standing well offshore." The knight folded his gloved hands behind his back. "Whose colors?" The man shook his head. "None visible from the rocks. The mist hides her mast." A faint crease appeared at the corner of the knight's mouth. "Then assume nothing. Signal the first boat to keep west beneath the cliffs." His orders came as calmly as before, though he spoke them more quickly now. "The tide still favors us." Edric leaned close to the king, scarcely daring to whisper, "If that vessel belongs to Dragonstone..." He allowed the thought to trail away. Viserys understood. Ravens had not yet flown from the quarry. Sir Harold remained hours behind them. No rescue should have arrived so soon. Either fortune had chosen a strange moment to smile upon them, or the ship outside belonged to someone entirely unconnected with the crown. Betting the kingdom's hopes upon chance was rarely wise. The king turned instead toward the landing, measuring distances rather than possibilities. The narrow ledge wound downward in two long bends before reaching the water. It offered almost no cover beyond scattered stone outcrops worn smooth by centuries of spray. Any advance would be seen before the halfway point, and archers posted upon the landing could command the entire approach. Mellos seemed to reach the same conclusion. "We cannot simply walk to them," the old Meister murmured. Talbot stared toward the cavern roof, where broken chains still hung from ancient pulleys. "Perhaps not," he said quietly. But the quarryman moved stone without touching the ledges. Viserys followed the young man's gaze. Above the landing, suspended across the cavern, stretched a weathered system of thick beams anchored into the rock. Most had rotted away or collapsed long ago, yet one heavy timber still supported an iron trolley suspended upon rusted wheels. Beneath it hung frayed lengths of rope ending in a broad wooden platform scarcely larger than a wagon bed. It had once carried quarried blocks across the cavern without forcing laborers onto the dangerous ledge below. Mellos frowned skeptically. "That contraption must be older than my grandfather." Talbot nodded. "Old, yes. Broken, perhaps not." The young charcoal burner's son crossed carefully to the nearest winch, fixed against the cavern wall. He brushed away moss and centuries of dust before testing the great wooden handles. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a groan deep enough to vibrate through the stone beneath their feet, the mechanism shifted by a finger's breadth. Talbot's eyes widened. "The gears still catch." He turned another fraction. Rust showered onto the floor. Somewhere overhead came the shrill complaint of iron grinding against iron. Viserys winced at the noise. certain it would carry across the cavern. It did. Every head upon the landing snapped toward the sound. The cloaked knight's gaze lifted immediately to the upper ledge where the king's company stood, partly concealed among broken pillars. Recognition flashed only for an instant before he acted. "Archers!" he commanded. "Above you!" Two bowmen sprang toward stacked crates, while the others scattered for cover. Viserys drew his sword. As the first arrow struck the stone only an arm's length from Tobit, exploding into splinters. The young man instinctively ducked behind the winch, breathing in frightened gasps. "Keep turning," Viserys called. "Whatever happens, keep turning." Another arrow hissed past, glancing harmlessly from the rock beside Mellos. Edric pulled the old master behind a thick stone pillar just before a third shaft buried itself in the place where he had been standing. The winch groaned louder with every desperate turn of Tobit's shoulders. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the suspended platform began creeping across the cavern upon its ancient rails. Dust and flakes of rust drifted from the beams above like reddish snow. Sir Harold would have cursed the plan as madness, Viserys thought, yet madness sometimes proved the only path left open. Below, the cloaked knight understood their purpose almost immediately. "Cut the ropes," he ordered. One of his men rushed toward the landing's far side where the platform's guidelines descended to massive stone anchors. Before he could reach them, Edric snatched up a discarded quarry hammer lying near the ledge and hurled it with every ounce of strength left in his weary body. The heavy tool spun through the air, striking the man squarely between the shoulders. He stumbled headlong into the water with a startled cry, vanishing beneath the dark surface. The guide ropes remained untouched. Edric stared after the splash in disbelief, scarcely believing his own throw. The platform lurched halfway across the cavern before stopping abruptly. One of the rusted wheels had jammed against the warped rail high above. Tobit strained against the winch until his face reddened, but the ancient mechanism refused to move another inch. The suspended platform swayed gently over open water, close enough to tempt hope, yet too far from either side to serve its purpose. Mellos closed his eyes briefly. "Seven save us," he muttered. Viserys looked from the motionless platform to the landing below, where the cloaked knight calmly accepted the delay, as though expecting it all along. No. The knight stepped into the open, unconcerned by the arrows no longer needed. He removed his helmet at last and tucked it beneath one arm. His hair had thinned with age, streaked heavily with gray, while a neatly trimmed beard framed a face weathered by wind and long campaigns. Rather than luxury, there was nothing remarkable about him save his eyes. They remained steady, patient, and entirely without panic. He looked upward until his gaze found Viserys across the gulf of water. When he spoke, he needed no shout. The cavern carried every word. "Your Grace," he called, inclining his head with measured respect. "I had hoped we might meet somewhere less damp." Viserys stepped from behind the pillar, ignoring Mellos's anxious glance. "You know me. I have served your house in one fashion or another for many years. You have robbed it in this instance." The knight smiled faintly, though there was no humor in the expression. "No, your grace, I have robbed someone who intended to rob you." The words hung in the cavern like another echo from the sea. Even the men beside the knight exchanged uncertain glances. Viserys searched the stranger's face for any sign of mockery, but found none. The man's voice carried conviction rather than insolence, as though he believed every syllable he had spoken. Before the king could answer, another horn sounded outside the cave, louder than the first and much nearer now. This time the knight's calm finally faltered. He turned sharply toward the cave mouth, and for the first time since the pursuit had begun, genuine urgency entered his eyes. The second blast of the horn rolled into the cavern with far greater force than the first, its deep note mingling with the crash of waves until the stone itself seemed to tremble. Men upon the landing abandoned their careful composure, turning toward the mouth of the sea cave with open uncertainty. One sailor hurried to the edge of the timber pier, climbing onto a slick boulder for a clearer view beyond the surf. The cloaked knight did not call after him. Instead, he remained where he stood, listening with the concentration of a commander, measuring possibilities rather than sounds. Viserys watched the change closely. Whatever had appeared beyond the cliffs had become dangerous enough to disrupt even a carefully prepared escape. The sailor scrambled back only moments later, breathing hard from exertion. "A war galley, sir," he called. "One galley and 2 smaller escorts. They've rounded the southern point." The knight's jaw tightened. "Whose banners?" The sailor shook his head. "Still hidden by the mist. But they're steering toward the cliffs." For the first time, the knight looked not toward the approaching ships, but toward the narrow channel where the first boat had already disappeared. His calculations had plainly shifted. If those vessels belonged to the crown, the hidden cargo might yet be intercepted. If they belonged to another lord, the danger became even less predictable. Viserys took a single step closer to the edge of the ledge, keeping well beyond bowshot. "You claimed you robbed someone who meant to rob the Iron Throne," he called across the cavern. "Explain yourself." The knight's eyes returned to the king. Around him, his men waited uneasily for fresh orders, but he raised one hand for silence. "If I do," he replied, "you will discover that your enemies are seated nearer your council table than these caves." Melos stiffened beside the king, while Edric glanced between them with growing confusion. Such words could easily be another deception, yet they were spoken with unsettling confidence. "You forged my command," Viserys answered. "You arranged an ambush against royal guards and carried away property entrusted to the crown." His voice remained calm despite the accusation. "Those are not the acts of a loyal servant." The knight inclined his head slightly. "No, they are the acts of a man denied every lawful path left to him." He paused before continuing. "Had I ridden openly to King's Landing, I would never have crossed the city gates alive. Had I written letters, they would have vanished before reaching your hand." His gaze remained fixed upon the king. "So I chose the only road that remained, though I expected history would judge me poorly." The reply unsettled Viserys more than open defiance would have done. Men who sought only wealth usually spoke of silver. Men who sought power spoke of rights. This stranger spoke instead of necessity. That did not make him truthful, but neither did it fit the pattern of an ordinary outlaw. The king searched his memory again for the name Sir Lymond and found only fragments of forgotten tourneys and distant reports. Somewhere, this man's path had crossed the affairs of the realm long before today. Viserys simply had not recognized it. Below, one of the knight's followers stepped forward impatiently. "Sir, we should leave. The boats." The knight silenced him with nothing more than a glance. "No," he said, "the first boat cannot be recalled before it reaches open water. Panic now serves no purpose." His composure returned almost instantly, though it carried a heavier weariness than before. Viserys noticed it then. Beneath the commander's discipline lay exhaustion, the sort earned over many sleepless weeks, rather than one difficult day. Whatever burden he carried had been growing long before the convoy disappeared. Melos leaned toward the king, speaking so quietly that only those nearest could hear. "Your Grace, delay favors us." Viserys understood immediately. Every moment spent talking allowed the unknown warships outside to draw nearer. The old maester continued, "If they are ours, the sea closes behind him. If they are not, he cannot know their purpose. Uncertainty weakens every plan." The king gave the smallest nod. He had no intention of trusting the stranger, but neither would he waste an advantage freely offered by time itself. "Very well," Viserys called across the water. "You say another sought to steal from the crown. Who?" The knight answered without hesitation. "A man you have never suspected, because his loyalty has always appeared too perfect." Before he could say more, a shout erupted from the cave mouth. Another sailor came stumbling across the landing, soaked to the waist by seawater. "Dragon banners," he cried. "The galley flies the three-headed dragon." A murmur spread instantly among the armed men. Several looked toward the seaward tunnel as though already considering flight. Edric stared in astonishment. "Dragonstone," he whispered. "It must be Dragonstone." Relief washed briefly across his face. Before caution returned, Viserys remained outwardly composed, yet inwardly he felt the balance shift. Sir Harold had not possessed enough time to send ravens. That meant the approaching galley had not come because of the missing convoy. It had arrived for some entirely different purpose, guided only by fortune into the heart of this hidden struggle. Such fortune could not be relied upon for long, but it had created a narrow opening. The knight recognized the same truth. He turned immediately toward two of his remaining men. "Take the second boat," he ordered. "You will not catch the first, but you may yet warn them." Neither man moved. Outside, the sound of oars echoed faintly beyond the cave entrance, accompanied now by shouted commands carried across the water. Whoever commanded the approaching galley had already begun searching the cliffs. The two soldiers exchanged uncertain looks before finally obeying, running toward the smaller vessel tied at the landing. Their confidence had vanished. Every hurried movement betrayed it. As they reached the mooring lines, the ancient platform suspended above the cavern groaned once more. Tobbit, who had refused to abandon the rusted winch, despite every arrow and every danger, gave one last desperate pull upon the great wooden handle. Something deep within the old mechanism snapped with a crack like breaking timber. For an instant, nothing happened. Then the jammed wheel lurched free. The platform surged forward along the overhead rail, gathering unexpected speed as centuries of accumulated strain released all at once. Every face in the cavern turned upward as the heavy wooden platform thundered across the gap toward the landing, carrying with it a shower of rust, splintered timber, and the sudden promise that the distance between king and conspirator was about to disappear. The ancient platform roared across the cavern with terrifying speed, its rusted wheels shrieking against iron rails that had not carried such weight in generations. Dust burst from the overhead beams in thick gray clouds, while splinters of weathered timber rained into the dark water below. Men on the landing scattered in every direction, some throwing themselves flat against the stone while others stumbled backward in blind surprise. The platform struck the final support with a thunderous crash that echoed through every chamber beneath the cliffs. For one impossible heartbeat, the entire structure seemed ready to tear itself apart. Then, with a groan like an old giant waking from sleep, it held. "Move!" Viserys shouted. Edric sprang onto the platform first, followed immediately by Tobbit, who barely caught his balance before the swaying boards lurched beneath his feet. Mellos hesitated only long enough to gather his satchel beneath one arm before climbing aboard with surprising determination for a man of his years. Viserys followed sword in hand while the platform rocked dangerously beneath their combined weight. There were no ropes to guide it back. The broken mechanism had delivered them across the cavern only once, and there would be no returning by the same path. Ahead lay the landing and the men waiting upon it. The first smuggler recovered quickly enough to raise his axe, but Edric met him before the blow could fall. The younger man had never been celebrated as a warrior, yet desperation lent force to his swing. Steel rang sharply as their weapons met, the impact driving both men backward across the wet planks. Nearby, Tobbit seized a discarded boat hook and thrust it awkwardly toward another attacker, keeping him just beyond striking distance through sheer determination rather than skill. Mellos wisely retreated behind a stack of crates, clutching the recovered parchments against his chest as though they were worth more than his own life. In that moment, perhaps they were. Sir Lyman did not rush forward with his followers. Instead, he stepped calmly toward the center of the landing, drawing his sword with slow precision until the polished blade caught the pale light filtering through the cave mouth. He watched Viserys approach without anger or haste. "I had hoped," he said, "that we might speak before steel decided matters." Viserys answered by raising his own sword into guard. "You had every opportunity." The knight inclined his head, "not one that left either of us alive." Their blades met a heartbeat later, the clear ring of Valyrian-forged steel against castle-forged steel carrying above every other sound in the cavern. Sir Lyman fought with the economy of a veteran who had survived enough battles to abandon every unnecessary flourish. His sword moved only when required, each cut precise, each step carefully measured upon the slick timber. Viserys quickly understood that he faced no tourney champion seeking glory, but a man shaped by real campaigns where mistakes buried the dead without songs. The king yielded a pace, then another, testing rather than pressing. Years had dulled neither his balance nor his judgment, though he knew well that Sir Harold would have fared better in such a contest. Even so, Viserys had not come merely to watch others risk themselves. "You are protecting a thief," Sir Lyman said between exchanges. "I am protecting the crown. The crown and the man who seeks to hollow it are no longer the same." Viserys answered with a swift cut that forced the knight to break his rhythm for the first time. "Then name him." "I cannot." "You mean you will not?" "I mean that if I speak before you possess proof, he will destroy us both." The words struck harder than any sword blow. Viserys saw no fear in the man's face, only grim conviction. Yet conviction alone could not excuse ambush, murder, and treason. A violent crash interrupted them as one of the cavern's oldest support beams finally surrendered to age and strain. The shattered timber plunged into the water beside the landing, sending a wave crashing across the planks. Boats slammed hard against their moorings, while loose crates toppled into the surf. Above, the overloaded rail twisted violently, showering the cavern with fragments of rotten wood. Tobit cried out as the platform shifted behind them, its rear corner dropping several feet before wedging crookedly against the broken support. Escape through the upper passage had vanished. The sea now offered the only way out. Outside the cave, the sound of shouted commands grew unmistakably louder. Dragon banners appeared beyond the narrow entrance at last, crimson standards snapping in the stiff wind as a royal galley cautiously approached the hidden inlet. Archers lined its rails, scanning the cliffs, while sailors struggled against the swirling tide. Whoever commanded the vessel had spotted movement within the cavern. A warning horn sounded once more, followed almost immediately by the sharp call of officers directing longboats into the water. Reinforcements had arrived, though whether they could reach the landing before the fighting ended remained uncertain. One of Sir Lyman's remaining men broke for the smaller boat still tied beside the pier. "Save yourselves," he shouted. Another followed without waiting for orders. Sir Lyman did not call them back. He merely watched as they pushed away from the landing, panic replacing discipline at last. Before the boat cleared the rocks, an arrow flashed from the mouth of the cave. It struck the lead oarsman squarely in the shoulder. A second shaft buried itself in the gunwale. The boat spun broadside to the waves, slammed against a jagged outcrop, and overturned. Dark water swallowed men, oars, and shattered planks alike. Viserys and Sir Lyman lowered their blades almost at the same instant. The knight looked toward the cave entrance where the longboats of Dragonstone were already drawing nearer, then slowly released a long breath. "The first boat is all that matters now," he said quietly. "If it reaches the man waiting beyond the bay, everything we have done here becomes meaningless." He reached beneath his cloak with his free hand, moving so deliberately that Viserys did not strike. From an inner pocket, he withdrew a tightly folded piece of oilskin sealed with dark wax. "This is why I remained." He extended it hilt first, offering the packet rather than concealing it. "I could not trust anyone else to carry it." Viserys accepted the packet without taking his eyes from the knight. The seal bore no noble sigil, only the impression of a plain signet ring marked by 3 tiny stars surrounding a narrow tower, the same mark they had found upon the murder weapon in the quarry. Before the king could break the wax, Sir Lyman spoke one final time. "Do not open it here, your grace. Read it only after the first boat has been found. Otherwise you may chase the wrong enemy while the right one smiles beside your throne." At that instant, the first Dragonstone longboat crossed the threshold of the sea cave, its rowers driving hard through the swell as armored men rose behind tall shields. The hunt beneath the hills had ended. The reckoning upon the waters of Blackwater Bay was about to begin. The first longboat struck the landing with a solid thud, its hull scraping against the weathered timbers as Dragonstone men leaped ashore with shields raised and swords already drawn. Their captain halted only when he recognized the cloaked figure standing before them. He dropped immediately to one knee. "Your Grace." Relief spread across the faces of the arriving soldiers, though it was tempered by confusion as they took in the shattered beams, the bound prisoners, and the strangers standing among them. Viserys lowered his sword at last. "Secure every man who still lives," he ordered. "No one leaves these caves until I have questioned them." The command restored order with remarkable speed. Panic gave way to discipline, and the cavern that had echoed with steel only moments before filled instead with the measured voices of trained soldiers carrying out their duty. Sir Lyman surrendered without resistance. He removed his sword belt and placed it carefully upon the landing before extending both empty hands. There was no trace of defeat in his expression, only the quiet weariness of a man whose task had finally reached its end. One of the Dragonstone captains stepped forward to bind his wrists, but Viserys raised a hand. "No chains." The captain hesitated before obeying. Sir Lyman inclined his head in silent gratitude, though he said nothing further. Mellos watched the exchange thoughtfully, understanding as well as the king that desperate criminals rarely surrendered so completely when escape still seemed possible. Within the hour, sailors had launched every seaworthy craft hidden inside the cavern. The overturned boat was recovered along with 2 exhausted survivors dragged from the icy water before the tide claimed them. More importantly, fresh scouts sent along the coast soon returned with welcome news. The first boat had not escaped into open water. A sudden change in the tide had forced it into a narrow channel west of the cliffs, where the Dragonstone galley had intercepted it after a brief pursuit. No battle had followed. Seeing the royal warship bearing down upon them, the smugglers had thrown down their oars and surrendered. The hidden cargo had been recovered intact. The sealed coffer bearing the sigil of King Jaehaerys rested upon the captain's table aboard the galley, exactly as described in the Castellan's report. Beside it stood another chest of darker wood, smaller than the others, and entirely without markings. Iron bands wrapped tightly around its sides, while an unusually complex lock sealed the lid. Viserys recognized it immediately as the mysterious 7th chest added to the convoy under his forged authority. No one aboard claimed to possess its key. Mellos examined the lock briefly before looking toward the king. "This was crafted in King's Landing," he observed, "not Dragonstone." The detail, though small, tightened the web already forming around the conspiracy. The voyage back across Blackwater Bay passed beneath clearing skies. The storm that had accompanied the beginning of the search had finally broken apart, revealing pale sunlight upon the water and long bands of blue between drifting clouds. Viserys stood alone at the stern while the sea stretched endlessly behind the galley, his thoughts lingering upon every step that had led them beneath the hills. Wormwood, wet stone, hidden tunnels, false inventories, men hired without knowing the whole design. None of it had been random. Each piece belonged to a plan, assembled patiently over many months by hands that remained largely unseen. Recovering the cargo had ended one danger, but it had revealed another concealed far closer to the heart of the realm. Only after the fleet anchored safely beneath the walls of Dragonstone did Viserys retire with Mellos into the Castellan's solar. There, with the doors barred against interruption, the king placed the plain oilskin packet upon the table. the wax seal bearing the tower and 3 stars cracked softly beneath his thumb. Inside lay a single folded parchment covered in careful handwriting. It contained no accusations, no dramatic confession, and no list of traitors. Instead, it recorded dates, payments, and the movements of several royal officials over the previous 3 years. Beside certain entries appeared the same name again and again, never accompanied by a title, only a single initial that even Mellos could not immediately identify. The old maester read the page twice before setting it down with uncommon gravity. "These are not proofs," he said quietly. "Not yet. They are threads." Viserys nodded. "Enough threads can bind a man?" Mellos met the king's gaze across the table. "Or ensnare an innocent one." The warning was wisely given. The parchment hinted at corruption reaching beyond a single hedge knight or stolen convoy, yet hints alone could not condemn anyone before the Iron Throne. Viserys carefully folded the document once more. "Then no one beyond this room learns of it until the truth stands beside it." The mysterious 7th chest was opened only after its lock had finally yielded beneath the skill of Dragonstone's oldest smith. Those present expected jewels, coin, or perhaps some forgotten Valyrian relic worthy of such elaborate precautions. Instead, they found tightly wrapped bundles of correspondence spanning decades, many written during the final years of King Jaehaerys' reign. Alongside them rested original land grants bearing royal seals, private agreements between lesser lords, and reports concerning disputed inheritances that had never reached the royal archives. The documents possessed no glitter, yet Mellos understood their value at once. In dishonest hands, they could erase lawful claims, create false ones, and quietly reshape the loyalties of half the crownlands without drawing a single sword. Viserys ordered every recovered record returned to the royal archives under heavy guard, while the correspondence from the 7th chest was sealed within a new iron-bound coffer bearing his own signet. Only 3 men knew the complete truth of what had been recovered: the king, Grand Maester Mellos, and Sir Harold Westerling, who arrived on Dragonstone the following morning after delivering the prisoners into secure custody. When Harold learned that the cargo had been recovered, he allowed himself the faintest smile before bowing deeply. "The realm remains whole for another day, Your Grace," Viserys answered with quiet honesty, "because many men chose duty over comfort. Sir Lymond was never paraded through King's Landing in chains. After giving a full account of his actions, he was confined under guard while the king quietly verified every claim that could be tested. Some proved false, others proved disturbingly accurate. The investigation that followed reached no public conclusion, for Viserys chose silence over spectacle while evidence continued to gather. Officially, the missing convoy had been recovered after ordinary bandits were captured along the coast. The realm accepted that simple explanation without question, and life continued as it always had. Few ever suspected how close forged parchments had come to unsettling years of peace. Many winters later, old servants of Dragonstone still repeated a curious tale whenever storms swept across the island. They spoke of a forgotten convoy, hidden caves beneath the cliffs, and a king who rode without banners to recover something more valuable than gold. Those who had walked beside him remembered another detail as well. Wherever the trail had led, through abandoned quarries, ancient tunnels, or caverns open to the sea, the same scent had lingered in the damp air, bitter and unmistakable. It was the fragrance of wormwood growing stubbornly from cracks in black stone after rain, mingled forever with the smell of wet rock beneath Dragonstone. For those few who knew the truth, it remained the scent of a quiet victory that spared the realm from a wound most people never realized had nearly been struck. If you have walked this road from the first rain upon the Red Keep to the last tide beneath Dragonstone, you have seen that the greatest dangers in the realm are seldom those announced by banners or dragons. Kingdoms do not always bleed because armies march across their borders. More often they weaken because quiet hands alter records, whisper promises, and persuade honorable men that no one is watching. In such moments, a king is tested not by the strength of his sword, but by the patience to seek truth, where appearances offer easier answers. That is the burden George R.R. Martin's world places upon those who wear crowns. Every choice must be made before certainty arrives, and every victory leaves behind questions that cannot be answered by steel alone. You may have expected hidden treasure beneath the hills, yet the true prize was never gold. It was memory. A ledger, a royal grant, an old letter bearing a forgotten seal. These can reshape noble houses as surely as dragons once melted castle walls. Men who understand the truth rarely need to fight fair battles, because they wage quieter wars against the past itself. That is why so many conflicts in Westeros begin long before the first sword is drawn. The struggle is always for the right to decide whose story will survive and whose name will vanish from the page. Honor, too, reveals itself differently than songs would have you believe. Sir Harold remained loyal without hesitation, yet his loyalty demanded that he leave the king behind when every instinct urged him to stay. Talbot found courage not because he was fearless, but because he refused to flee after fear had already taken hold of him. Even Sir Lymond stood within that uneasy gray place, so familiar to Martin's tales, where a man may commit unforgivable deeds while believing he serves a greater good. In this world, virtue is rarely clean, and wickedness rarely announces itself with monstrous faces. You are left to judge people not by the certainty of their words, but by the weight of the choices they accept. Power itself proves strangely fragile. From afar, the Iron Throne appears immovable, surrounded by walls, guards, and ancient traditions. Yet beneath those walls run forgotten passages, hidden bargains, and ambitions older than the reign of any single king. No fortress can keep danger outside when betrayal learns to wear the face of duty. That is why Viserys succeeds, not through spectacle or overwhelming force, but by refusing to mistake comfort for safety. He walks into darkness because remaining upon the throne would have left him blind to the cracks beneath it. And so the tale returns to where it began. Imagine once more the rain falling across the pale towers of the Red Keep, soft enough that the city almost forgets the storm. The courtyards glisten, servants hurry through the mist, and somewhere a king stands quietly beside cold stone, looking beyond the walls toward a distant island where the scent of wormwood rises after the rain. If you linger there for a moment, listening to the wind and the steady fall of water, you may understand why the realm endures at all. Not because danger is absent, but because from time to time someone chooses to follow its faintest trail before it grows into a war.